Close your eyes for a moment and let your mind drift back across thousands of years to a land of golden sand, slow rivers, and quiet stars. We're going somewhere ancient tonight, somewhere with secrets buried deep beneath the earth and stories written in stone. Welcome to Egypt. Fact 1. The civilization we call ancient Egypt lasted for over 3,000 years, from around 3100 BCE all the way to 30 BCE. That is longer than almost any other civilization in human history. Think about that for a moment. 3,000 years of pharaohs, temples, harvests, and prayers. A story so long, it is almost impossible for the human mind to hold. And at the very heart of all of it was a river. Fact 2. The Nile River was everything to the ancient Egyptians. It was their source of fresh water, their highway for trade, and the reason their crops could grow in the middle of a vast, dry desert. Without the Nile, there would have been no Egypt at all. The ancient Egyptians called their fertile land Kemet, meaning the Black Land, named for the rich, dark soil that the river left behind each year when its waters gently receded. That flooding was not something to fear. It was something to celebrate. Fact 3. Every year, the Nile flooded its banks in a season the Egyptians called Akhet, the season of inundation. The floodwaters would spread across the surrounding land, leaving behind a layer of fine, dark silt that was extraordinarily good for growing food. Farmers would wait for the waters to pull back before planting their crops, wheat, barley, flax. And in this way, the rhythm of the whole year was tied to the rhythm of the river. Life moved slowly, gently, like the river itself. Fact 4. The ancient Egyptians divided their entire year into just 3 seasons, each one shaped by what the Nile was doing. There was Akhet, the flooding season. Then Peret, the growing season, when green things pushed up through the dark earth. And finally Shimu, the harvest season, when the land was dry and golden and full of grain. Time itself was organized around water. It is a beautiful way to live, letting the world around you set the pace. Fact 5. At the center of this world stood the pharaoh, a ruler who was not simply a king, but a living god. The ancient Egyptians believed the pharaoh was the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed god of the sky. When a pharaoh died, they were thought to become Osiris, god of the afterlife. The pharaoh was a bridge between the human world and the divine, the person who kept the universe in balance, who held back chaos, and kept the stars in their right places. Imagine carrying that weight, the weight of the entire sky. Fact 6. The ancient Egyptians had a word for this cosmic balance that the pharaoh was meant to uphold. They called it Ma'at, and it meant truth, justice, harmony, and order all woven into one. Ma'at was not just a concept, it was a goddess, depicted as a woman with a single white ostrich feather in her hair. After death, it was believed that a person's heart would be weighed on a great golden scale against that feather. If the heart was light, free of cruelty and wrongdoing, the soul could pass safely into the afterlife. If not, well, the night is too peaceful to think about that. Fact 7. The afterlife was not a distant hope for the ancient Egyptians. It was a destination they prepared for carefully and even enthusiastically. They called it the Field of Reeds, Aru, a paradise that looked remarkably like Egypt itself, but more beautiful, green and golden, peaceful, beside an eternal river. A place where loved ones would be reunited, where work was gentle and the harvest never ended. Death, to the ancient Egyptians, was simply a doorway. Fact 8. And to pass through that doorway safely, the body needed to be preserved. This gave rise to the extraordinary practice of mummification, a process that could take up to 70 days to complete. The embalmers were skilled and meticulous. They removed the internal organs, dried the body with a type of salt called natron, wrapped it carefully in hundreds of meters of white linen, and recited prayers over every step. It was not macabre to them. It was an act of deep love and devotion. Fact 9. The internal organs removed during mummification were not discarded. They were preserved in their own special jars, called canopic jars. There were 4 of them, each one protected by a different god, the sons of Horus. The liver, the lungs, the stomach, the intestines, each had its guardian, its protector, its divine caretaker. Even in death, you were never truly alone. The desert night is growing quieter now. The stars above Egypt are the same stars that shone over those ancient embalmers, over those careful farmers watching the river rise, over pharaohs who believed they held the sky in their hands. And somewhere beneath the sand, beneath the stone, their world is still sleeping, just like you, slowly, peacefully now. Let the river carry you. You're still here, drifting along the Nile. The water is dark and slow beneath a sky full of stars. The air smells of warm stone and dry grass. Somewhere in the distance, a torch flickers against the side of a temple wall, and the shadows of carved figures seem almost to breathe. We left you last time with the river, and the dead, and the quiet hum of a civilization that believed the universe could be kept in perfect balance. Tonight, we go a little deeper. Fact 10. The ancient Egyptians did not just believe in one or two gods. They worshipped a vast and intricate pantheon of over 2,000 deities. Each god had their own domain, their own personality, their own sacred animal or symbol. There were gods of the sun and gods of the moon, gods of childbirth and gods of medicine, gods of chaos and gods of wisdom. The world, to an ancient Egyptian, was absolutely alive with divine presence. In the river, in the cobra that crossed your path, in the ibis standing still at the water's edge. Nowhere was empty. Nothing was ordinary. Fact 11. One of the most important of all these gods was Ra, the sun god, the great creator, the one who sailed across the sky each day in a golden boat. The ancient Egyptians believed that every morning, Ra was reborn on the eastern horizon, journeyed across the heavens, and then descended into the underworld each night, where he had to battle the great serpent Apophis, a creature of darkness and chaos, before he could rise again. Every single sunrise was a victory. Every single dawn was a miracle that had been fought for in the dark. No wonder they watched the horizon so carefully. Fact 12. Ra was so central to Egyptian religion that many of the most powerful pharaohs incorporated his name directly into their own. Ramesses, one of the most famous names in all of ancient history, literally means born of Ra. When a pharaoh took the name of the sun god, they were not being poetic. They were making a theological statement. They were saying, I am of divine origin. The sun itself flows through me. And people believed them. Fact 13. The great temples of ancient Egypt were not simply places of worship. They were considered to be the literal homes of the gods. Inside each temple lived a sacred statue of the deity, which priests tended every single day, as though caring for a living being. The statue was woken each morning, washed, dressed, anointed with oil, and offered food. At night, it was put to rest. The god was a resident, not a symbol, and only the highest-ranking priests were permitted to enter the innermost sanctuary where the statue lived, the Holy of Holies, the dim and incense-filled heart of the temple. Most ordinary Egyptians never saw inside. They waited in the courtyards, in the sunlight, in hope. Fact 14. Priests in ancient Egypt were not necessarily lifelong holy men in the way we might imagine today. Many temples operated on a rotation system, where ordinary educated men would serve as priests for just 1 month out of every 4, then return to their regular lives as scribes, officials, or craftsmen. During their month of service, they were required to shave their entire bodies, including their eyebrows, bathe in cold water several times a day, and abstain from certain foods. Purity was not a state of mind. It was a rigorous, physical discipline. Fact 15. While priests cared for the gods, another group of people held perhaps even more practical power in ancient Egyptian society: the scribes. In a world where the vast majority of people could not read or write, a scribe was invaluable. They recorded taxes and harvests, copied sacred texts, drafted legal documents, wrote letters for those who could not write their own. Boys who showed promise could be sent to scribal schools as young as 5 years old, where they practiced writing on broken pieces of pottery called ostraca, before they were trusted with the precious, expensive papyrus. Learning to write was learning to hold the world in your hands. Fact 16. And what a writing system it was! Hieroglyphics, the ornate picture script that covers every temple wall, every tomb, every monument. is one of the most beautiful written languages ever created. The word itself comes from the Greek for sacred carved writing. There were over 700 individual hieroglyphic symbols, each one a tiny work of art, a seated man, a folded cloth, an owl with enormous eyes. The Egyptians called their own script Medu Neter, the words of the gods, and believed that the god Thoth himself had gifted it to humanity. Even the alphabet, to them, was divine. Fact 17. Hieroglyphics could be written in almost any direction, left to right, right to left, or top to bottom, and the reader had to look at which way the figures were facing to know which direction to read. If the owl is looking left, you read from the left. If the bird faces right, you begin on the right. It is a script that demands attention, that rewards patience. 4 centuries after the fall of ancient Egypt, no one alive could read it. The language of the gods had gone silent, until a stone changed everything. Fact 18. In 1799, a French soldier digging fortifications near the Egyptian town of Rosetta turned up a slab of dark granodiorite stone covered in 3 different scripts, hieroglyphics at the top, a later Egyptian script in the middle, and ancient Greek at the bottom. All 3 said the same thing. Scholars who could read Greek suddenly had a key. After years of painstaking work, a brilliant young Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion finally cracked the code in 1822. The ancient Egyptians could speak again, a civilization silent for 1,000 years, and then, suddenly, a whisper, and then a voice, and then a roar. The torchlight flickers on the temple wall. The carved figures hold their positions, patient and eternal. The river moves on. Somewhere beneath the earth, in a sealed chamber, words written by a scribe 3,000 years ago are still perfectly intact, waiting, just waiting to be read. Let that thought carry you gently now. The words are safe. The river is slow. The stars are where they always are. Everything is still. The night is deep now. The stars above the desert are impossibly bright, more stars than you could ever count, scattered like gold dust across a vast, dark cloth. The ancient Egyptians looked up at this same sky every night, for thousands of years. They mapped it, named it, wrote it down in careful columns of hieroglyphs. They were watchers, patient, devoted watchers. And tonight, we watch with them. Fact 26. The ancient Egyptians did not build only in stone. They were also master craftsmen in wood, gold, faience, a beautiful turquoise-glazed ceramic material, and glass. The objects found inside royal tombs are breathtaking in their delicacy and skill. Tiny golden sandals for the feet of a dead king. Necklaces made of thousands of individually strung beads. Furniture inlaid with ivory and ebony. A world of exquisite beauty, made for someone who would never see it with living eyes. Made for the afterlife, where beauty still mattered. It always mattered. Fact 27. One of the most treasured materials in all of ancient Egypt was not gold, but a deep blue pigment known simply as Egyptian blue, the very first synthetic pigment ever produced by human beings. It was created by heating together sand, copper, and calcium, and the result was a vivid, luminous blue unlike anything found naturally in the desert landscape. It was used to paint temple walls, to decorate coffins, to color the eyes of statues. Even today, under ultraviolet light, objects painted with Egyptian blue will glow, a soft, ghostly luminescence from thousands of years ago, still shining in the dark. Some things refuse to fade. The desert has grown very still around you now. The torches have burned low. Somewhere far above, Sirius rises slowly over the eastern horizon, right on schedule, as it has always been, as the Egyptians always knew it would be. The sky is keeping its ancient promises. The pyramid stands in the dark, aligned to its star. The Sphinx watches the east. And somewhere inside a sealed tomb, the ceiling is painted with the night sky, every decan in its place, every star exactly where it should be. All is in order. All is in balance. Ma'at endures. Let the stars carry you now, slowly, gently, into the deep, quiet dark. You are still here, still drifting, slowly, along the edges of that ancient world. The pyramid is behind you now, a dark triangle against a sky full of stars. The river moves quietly beside you, black and silver in the moonlight, carrying with it the faint smell of reeds and cool water. We have spoken of gods and builders, of stars and stones. But tonight, we turn towards something softer, something closer to the ground. Tonight, we talk about the people themselves. Fact 28. Ancient Egypt was, by the standards of the ancient world, a remarkably equal society in many respects, particularly when it came to women. Egyptian women had legal rights that women in ancient Greece or Rome could scarcely imagine. They could own property, inherit land, initiate divorce, conduct business, and bring legal cases to court entirely in their own names. A woman could own a house, run a shop, and leave her possessions to whomever she chose in a will. She was not the property of her husband. She was a person in her own right, with her own standing in the eyes of the law. In a world 4,000 years old, that is quietly remarkable. Fact 29. Egyptian marriages were not primarily religious ceremonies. They were practical and social arrangements, often marked simply by a couple moving in together and beginning to share their household. There was no elaborate wedding ritual in the way we might imagine today. What mattered was a family unit, the shared home, the children who might follow. Love, however, was deeply valued. We know this because ancient Egyptian love poetry has survived, and it is genuinely tender. Poems in which a young man compares his beloved to a lotus flower, or a woman describes her heart racing when she catches a glimpse of her lover across a garden. 3,000 years old, and somehow still immediately recognizable. A fact 30. Children in ancient Egypt were deeply cherished. Infant mortality was high, as it was throughout the ancient world, and parents took great care to protect their young children from illness and misfortune. Children wore protective amulets, small carved charms in the shapes of gods, animals, or sacred symbols, from a very young age. One of the most common was a small figure of the god Biz, a cheerful, leonine dwarf deity who was a protector of households, mothers, and children. His fierce little face, it was believed, scared away evil spirits. He was not elegant or imposing like the great gods of the temples. He was warm, domestic, loved in an ordinary, everyday way. Fact 31. When Egyptian children were old enough, they played. We know this because archaeologists have found their toys, wooden horses on wheels, leather balls, carved wooden animals with moving parts, small dolls made of clay, or wood with painted hair and bead jewelry. Some of these toys are so familiar, so immediately recognizable as things a child would love, that the distance of thousands of years seems to collapse entirely. A small wooden cat with a moving jaw, made to snap when you pulled a string. A child somewhere along the Nile, laughing, pulling the string, again and again. Some things have always been delightful. Fact 32. The ancient Egyptians took great care of their appearance, men and women alike. Both sexes wore kohl eyeliner, drawn in long sweeping lines around their eyes. This was not purely cosmetic. The dark pigment, made from ground minerals, helped to reduce the glare of the fierce Egyptian sun, and may also have had antibacterial properties that helped protect the eyes from infection in a dusty, hot climate. Beauty and practicality elegantly combined. Even in the afterlife, small cosmetic palettes and coal pots were placed in tombs, so that the dead would want for nothing in their grooming. Looking presentable, apparently, was eternal. Fact 33. Wigs were extremely fashionable in ancient Egypt, worn by both men and women of the upper classes. Human hair wigs, sometimes mixed with plant fibers, were carefully crafted, oiled, and scented. They were a symbol of status and refinement. Underneath their wigs, many wealthy Egyptians kept their natural hair very short or shaved their heads entirely, which was more practical in the intense heat. Children of all classes, boys and girls, often had their heads shaved too, except for one long braided lock left on the side of the head, known as the side lock of youth. When a child came of age, the side lock was ceremonially cut, a small, quiet ritual of growing up. Our fact 34. The ancient Egyptians were also passionate about cleanliness. Most people bathed daily, in the river, in basins at home, or in the bathing rooms that wealthier households possessed. They used a paste made from natron, that same salt used in mummification, as a kind of soap. They used castor oil and other plant-based oils to moisturize their skin against the drying effects of the desert air. They chewed on twigs from certain trees to clean their teeth, and archaeological evidence suggests they suffered from dental problems remarkably similar to our own, where abscesses, tooth loss, largely due to the grit that inevitably found its way into their bread from the grinding stones used to mill flour. Even paradise has its inconveniences. Fact 35. And speaking of bread, the ancient Egyptian diet was built around it. Bread and beer were the twin foundations of everyday life, consumed by everyone from the highest priest to the humblest field worker. Egyptologists have identified over 40 different types of bread from ancient Egypt, made with different grains, different shapes, different additives like honey, figs, or seeds. Beer was not a luxury or an indulgence. It was a nutritional staple, thick and slightly sweet, more like a liquid bread than the beer we know today. It provided calories, hydration, and a modest degree of safety from waterborne illness. Life, for most Egyptians, was simple and nourishing. Bread in the morning, beer in the evening, the river outside the door, the stars above the roof. Not so different, in the end, from the kind of life people have always quietly wanted. The night has grown very soft now. The village along the Nile is still. Cooking fires have burned down to embers. Children sleep with their small amulets tucked close, Biz watching over them with his funny fierce face. Somewhere nearby, a woman has left a cup of beer on the table and gone to bed, and the warm air carries the faint smell of baked bread. It is ordinary. It is ancient. It is deeply, quietly peaceful. Let it settle around you now, like warm sand, like still water. The river breathes. The village sleeps. And so can you. The village is still sleeping. The embers have gone cold, and the sky above the Nile has shifted. The stars have moved a little, the way they always do, slowly wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. The river makes its quiet sound against the reeds. A heron stands perfectly still at the water's edge, as herons have always stood, patient and silver in the dark. We have been walking through the everyday world of ancient Egypt, its bread and beer, its children and its cosmetics, its small and tender details. But tonight, we climb a little higher. We step into the corridors of power. Tonight, we meet the pharaohs. Our fact 36. Over the 3,000 years of ancient Egyptian civilization, there were more than 170 pharaohs, kings and queens who sat upon the throne of Egypt, wore the double crown, and carried the crook and flail that symbolized their divine authority. Historians divide this vast stretch of time into periods: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, separated by intermediate periods of instability and change. But through all of it, the idea of the pharaoh endured. The throne was never empty for long. Egypt always needed its living god. Fact 37. The most famous pharaoh of all time is almost certainly Tutankhamun, not because he was particularly powerful or long-reigning, but because of what was found when his tomb was opened. He became pharaoh as a child, probably around 9 or 10 years old, and died young, at approximately 18 or 19. His reign was brief and, by the grand standards of Egyptian history, relatively unremarkable. But his tomb, tucked into a modest cut in the rock of the Valley of the Kings, was somehow overlooked by ancient tomb robbers and survived almost entirely intact. When the archaeologist Howard Carter broke through its sealed door in November 1922, he found over 5,000 objects, gilded furniture, chariots, weapons, jewelry, and the now iconic golden death mask, weighing over 10 kilograms of solid gold. A boy king, forgotten for 3,000 years, and then suddenly the most famous Egyptian who ever lived. Fact 38. The Valley of the Kings, where Tutankhamun was found, is a narrow limestone valley on the west bank of the Nile near the ancient city of Thebes, modern-day Luxor. For nearly 500 years, from roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, it served as the royal burial ground for the pharaohs of the New Kingdom. 63 tombs have been discovered there so far, cut deep into the rock, their walls painted with vivid scenes of the afterlife and covered in carefully chosen texts to guide the dead king through the perils of the underworld. The west bank of the Nile was always the side of the dead, where the sun set, where darkness began. The east bank was the side of the living, where cities rose and people went about their days. Life and death, divided by a river. Fact 39. One of the greatest and most intriguing of all the pharaohs was a woman, Hatshepsut, who ruled Egypt not as a queen consort but as pharaoh in her own right, taking all the titles, all the regalia, and in many official depictions, even the traditional false beard worn by male rulers. She reigned for roughly 20 years in the 15th century BC and oversaw a period of remarkable prosperity. She dispatched a famous trading expedition to the mysterious land of Punt, thought to be somewhere along the Horn of Africa, and returned with myrrh trees, ebony, ivory, and live animals. She built one of the most beautiful temples in all of Egypt, the terraced mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, which still stands today, pale and elegant against its cliff face. After her death, attempts were made to erase her from history, her images chiseled away, her name removed from monuments. But she was too great to disappear entirely. The stone remembered her, even when the people tried to make it forget. Fact 40. Another towering figure of the New Kingdom was Ramesses II, known as Ramesses the Great, who ruled for an extraordinary 66 years, from 1279 to 1213 BCE. He was a warrior, a builder, and a prolific self-promoter who covered Egypt in monuments to his own greatness, often inscribing his name over the work of earlier pharaohs. He fathered somewhere between 45 and over 100 children. He fought the Hittites at the famous Battle of Kadesh, one of the earliest battles in history for which detailed accounts survive on both sides, and afterwards negotiated what is considered the world's oldest surviving peace treaty. A warrior who made peace. A man who built so much that Egypt still bears his fingerprints. Fact 41. Ramesses II lived so long that many of his subjects had known no other pharaoh. When he finally died at around 90 years of age, he was so old and his reign so long that the people around him may genuinely have wondered whether Egypt could survive without him. He suffered from arthritis, dental abscesses, and hardening of the arteries. We know this because his mummy, one of the best preserved in existence, has been examined by modern medical science in extraordinary detail. He was tall, red-haired in his youth, and his spine was severely curved in old age, bending him forward towards the earth he had walked upon for so many decades. Even gods grow old. Fact 42. The mummies of many of the great pharaohs have survived and are held today in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. In 2021, 22 royal mummies, including those of Ramesses II, Hatshepsut, and other great rulers, were transported across Cairo in an extraordinary ceremonial procession, each one traveling in a specially designed climate-controlled vehicle, escorted by guards in ancient costume, accompanied by music and crowds of onlookers. The procession moved slowly through the modern city, past tower blocks and traffic lights and illuminated billboards. Pharaohs in the 21st century, still moving through their kingdom, still being honored, still being seen. Fact 43. Not all great rulers of Egypt were born Egyptian. In the final centuries of the civilization, Egypt was ruled at various times by Nubians, Persians, and eventually Macedonian Greeks, after Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE. The famous Cleopatra, Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt, was of Macedonian Greek descent. And yet she was reportedly the first ruler of her dynasty to actually learn to speak the Egyptian language. She also spoke 8 or 9 other languages, including Ethiopian, Hebrew, and Aramaic. She was brilliant, politically astute, and deeply devoted to Egypt, a ruler who chose to become Egyptian in a way her ancestors had not. She was the last. When she died in 30 BCE, Egypt became a province of Rome, and 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization quietly came to an end. The throne stood empty at last. The heron at the water's edge lifts its wings now, slowly, and rises into the dark air above the river. It climbs higher and higher until it is just a pale shape against the stars, and then it is gone. The valley is very quiet. In the rock beneath your feet, in chambers sealed for millennia, the great ones are sleeping, golden and still and perfect, wrapped in their linen, surrounded by the things they loved. They ruled the world. And now the world is ruled by silence and starlight and the slow dark river. Rest now. You are in good company. The valley is still. The great pharaohs sleep in their stone chambers beneath your feet, and the stars continue their slow wheel overhead. The air is cool now, the way desert air always becomes cool at night, surprising and gentle after the fierce heat of the day. A little breeze moves through the palm trees along the riverbank, and the fronds sigh softly against each other. We have walked among kings and queens. We have stood at the feet of pyramids and looked up at stars that served as calendars. But tonight, we step away from the grand and the monumental. Tonight we go somewhere smaller, and in its smallness, somehow more intimate. Tonight, we visit the doctors. Fact 44. The ancient Egyptians were among the first people in human history to practice medicine in a systematic, rational way. Rather than attributing all illness purely to the displeasure of the gods, as many ancient cultures did, Egyptian physicians developed a body of practical knowledge based on observation and experience. They understood that the heart was central to the body's function. They recognized different categories of illness. They made diagnoses, prescribed treatments, and kept careful written records of what worked and what did not. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to around 1600 BC, but thought to be copied from an even older text, describes 48 surgical cases in methodical, clinical detail, injuries to the head, neck, and chest, each one examined, diagnosed, and assigned prognosis. It reads less like a prayer and more like a doctor's notes. Fact 45. Egyptian physicians were specialists. There were doctors who dealt only with the eyes, doctors who dealt only with the stomach, doctors who focused on the teeth, and doctors who treated invisible ailments, what we might today recognize as conditions of the mind. The Greek historian Herodotus, visiting Egypt in the 5th century BCE, remarked with some amazement that every physician treated just one disease and no more. Specialization in medicine, it turns out, is not a modern invention. It is an ancient Egyptian one. Fact 46. Honey was one of the most important medicines in the Egyptian physician's toolkit. It was applied to wounds and burns as an antibacterial dressing, a use that modern science has thoroughly validated, since honey does indeed have genuine antimicrobial properties. Willow bark, which contains a compound closely related to aspirin, was used to reduce fever and relieve pain. Garlic was prescribed for a remarkable range of conditions. Castor oil was used as a laxative. Many of the herbal remedies recorded in ancient Egyptian medical papyri have turned out, when examined by modern pharmacologists, to have a genuine biological basis. They were not guessing. They were observing, remembering, and passing knowledge down. Healing, carefully accumulated over generations. Fact 47. Alongside their rational medicine, the Egyptians also maintained a rich tradition of magical healing, and the two approaches were not considered contradictory. A physician might clean and dress a wound practically, and then recite a spell over it as well, for good measure. Amulets were worn to protect against specific diseases. Certain words, spoken in the right way at the right time, were believed to carry genuine healing power. The goddess Sekhmet, fierce lioness-headed deity of war and pestilence, was also paradoxically the patron of physicians, because the one who could send disease could also withdraw it. Power and healing, held in the same hands. In a world without germ theory, that was not unreasonable. It was imaginative. Fact 48. The ancient Egyptians also had a sophisticated understanding of the natural world around them, born of thousands of years of careful observation. They catalogued hundreds of species of plants and animals, and their relationship with certain creatures was particularly deep and complex. Cats, famously, were sacred, associated with the goddess Bastet, a gentle cat-headed deity of home, fertility, and protection. Killing a cat, even accidentally, was considered a serious offense. When a household cat died, the family would shave their eyebrows as a sign of mourning, and the cat might be mummified and given a proper burial. Millions of cat mummies have been found in Egypt. Millions. They were loved on a civilizational scale. Fact 49. But cats were not the only animals to receive this honor. Sacred ibises were mummified in their millions and offered at the temples of Thoth, the god of wisdom. Crocodiles were venerated as manifestations of the god Sobek, some kept in temple pools, fed meat by priests, adorned with golden earrings. Baboons were sacred to Thoth as well. Falcons to Horus, ibises to Thoth, dogs and jackals to Anubis, the god of embalming, who was depicted with the sleek black head of a jackal. Even the dung beetle, the scarab, was sacred, rolled up in the image of the sun god Ra pushing his solar disk across the sky. In ancient Egypt, the divine was everywhere. You could step on it if you were not careful. Fact 50. The scarab beetle in particular occupied a very special place in the Egyptian imagination. The image of the scarab, wings spread, forelegs raised, became one of the most ubiquitous symbols in all of Egyptian art and jewelry. Scarab amulets were worn by the living for protection and good fortune. A large scarab amulet called a heart scarab was placed over the chest of the mummified dead, inscribed with a spell to prevent the heart from testifying against its owner at the moment of judgment. The humble dung beetle, going about its ordinary business in the dust, had been transformed into a symbol of resurrection, of the eternal turning of the sun, of the soul's journey through darkness back towards light. An insect, carrying the weight of eternity. The breeze moves again through the palm trees. Somewhere nearby in the warm darkness, a cat is sitting perfectly still, watching something only it can see, with the serene and ancient expression that cats have always worn, as if they know something we do not. Perhaps they do. They have been sacred for a very long time. The river turns softly in its banks. The scarab sleeps in its crack in the warm stone. The ibis tucks its long beak beneath its wing. And the whole intricate, breathing, sacred world of ancient Egypt settles into stillness around you, every creature in its place, every god in its temple, every star in its proper position in the great turning sky. You are exactly where you should be. Everything is as it should be. Close your eyes a little more now. Let the warm stone and the cool river air hold you. The cat is watching over you. The cat has curled up beside you now. Its eyes are closed, its breathing slow and even, and the night has grown deeper and more still. The river makes its patient sound. The palm trees have stopped their sighing. Even the stars seem to have settled, as though they too have found their most comfortable position in the sky. We have come a long way together through this ancient world. We have visited temples and tombs, markets and medicine rooms, the courts of pharaohs and the homes of ordinary families. We have met gods and scribes and sacred beetles. But there's one place we have not yet visited. One place that hummed at the very center of Egyptian life, connecting everything to everything else. Tonight, we go to the river, not just to look at it, but to travel upon it. Fact 51. The Nile was ancient Egypt's great highway, the primary means by which people, goods, and information moved across the country. Egypt was essentially a long, narrow ribbon of habitable land stretched along the river's banks, and almost everything of importance happened within reach of the water. Traveling north, downstream towards the Mediterranean, was easy. The current carried you. Traveling south, upstream, was almost equally easy, because the prevailing winds in Egypt blow from north to south, meaning you could simply raise a sail and let the wind push you against the current. The ancient Egyptian hieroglyph for traveling north showed a boat with its sail down. The hieroglyph for traveling south showed a boat with its sail raised. The river and the wind, working together, as if the land itself wanted its people to move freely. Fact 52. Egyptian boats were extraordinarily varied. From simple reed rafts used by fishermen in the marshes, to large wooden cargo vessels that transported enormous blocks of stone from the quarries of Aswan hundreds of kilometers downstream to the building sites of Memphis and Thebes. The largest ceremonial boats were things of great beauty, gilded and painted, fitted with cabins and awnings, carrying statues of the gods between temples during religious festivals. Even the dead traveled by boat. Funeral processions crossed the Nile from the east bank of the living to the west bank of the dead, the coffin resting on a boat draped in white linen, mourners gathered at the water's edge. Life moved by water, and so did death. Fact 53. At the mouth of the Nile, where the river fans out into the Mediterranean Sea, lay the great delta region, a wide, flat, fertile triangle of land threaded with channels and rich with marshes. This was a place of extraordinary abundance. Papyrus reeds grew in thick stands along the waterways, and papyrus was to ancient Egypt what paper is to us, and more. It was writing material, certainly, thin sheets made by pressing and drying strips of the reed's pith, but it was also used to make sandals, baskets, rope, matting, and small boats. A single plant and an entire toolkit. The Egyptians wrote on the world, and the world grew back to give them more to write on. Fact 54. The city of Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt in 331 BCE, became one of the greatest centers of learning the ancient world ever produced. At its heart was the famous Library of Alexandria, an institution dedicated to collecting all the knowledge in the world on every subject, in every language. At its height, the library is said to have held somewhere between 40,000 and 700,000 scrolls. Scholars came from across the known world to study there: mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, philosophers, poets. It was, for a time, the closest thing the ancient world had to a university, a building full of everything anyone had ever thought to write down. The very idea of it is beautiful. A fact 55. One of the scholars who worked in Alexandria was a man named Eratosthenes, who served as the chief librarian in the 3rd century BCE. Using nothing more than a well, a stick, and careful observation of shadows at different locations in Egypt on the same day, he calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy. He was off by only a small percentage. Standing in the library he oversaw, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of scrolls, he had measured the entire planet with a piece of wood and a curious mind. The earth gave up its secret to a librarian. Fact 56. Trade was the lifeblood of the Egyptian economy, and Egyptian merchants and officials conducted it across an astonishing range of territory. To the south, they traded with Nubia for gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animals. To the east, caravans crossed the Sinai Desert to Canaan and beyond. To the north, ships crossed the Mediterranean. To the northeast, they sailed the Red Sea to reach the mysterious land of Punt, bringing back incense, myrrh, and living trees carefully packed in baskets of soil for the long journey home. Egypt sat at a crossroads of the ancient world, and it knew how to use that position. The smell of myrrh and incense drifting across the water, the soft creak of a loaded ship settling in a harbor at dawn. Fact 57. Gold was perhaps Egypt's most important export, and the ancient Egyptians had access to enormous quantities of it, mined primarily in the desert regions to the east of the Nile and in Nubia to the south. Foreign kings wrote to the pharaoh begging for gold in terms that border on the desperate. In the famous Amarna letters, a remarkable cache of clay tablets discovered in the late 19th century, containing diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and the kingdoms of the ancient Near East, a king of Babylon writes to the pharaoh that in Egypt, gold is like dust, it is gathered up from the ground. He was not entirely wrong. Egypt was fabulously, structurally, geologically wealthy. The ground itself was generous. Fact 58. This wealth funded not only wars and monuments, but also art, and the art of ancient Egypt is one of its most enduring and recognizable gifts to the world. Egyptian art followed a strict set of conventions that remained remarkably consistent for thousands of years. Human figures were depicted according to a precise formula: the head shown in profile, the eye shown from the front, the shoulders shown straight on, the legs shown in profile. Not because Egyptian artists could not observe reality accurately, but because this composite view showed every important part of the human body as clearly as possible simultaneously. It was not naive. It was a deliberate choice, a visual language with its own internal logic. A grammar of the human form, held steady across 30 centuries. The Night River is wide and dark and full of reflections. Somewhere upstream, a lamp burns in the window of a house on the bank, its light stretching in a long golden line across the water towards you. A fisherman's boat rocks gently in the current, its owner long since gone home to his bread and his beer and his sleeping children. The scrolls of Alexandria are ash now, the library lost to fire and time and the slow entropy of all things. But what was written in them was not entirely lost. Fragments survived. Ideas persisted. The circumference of the earth, once calculated, could be calculated again. Knowledge, it turns out, is harder to destroy than the buildings that house it. The lamp in the window burns on. The river carries its light downstream, unspooling it gently into the dark. Let it carry you too, further and further from the waking world, into the warm, gold-lit current. The water knows the way. The lamp on the water has gone now. Its light dissolved slowly into the current, spreading thinner and thinner until it was just a faint warmth in the darkness, and then nothing at all. The river moves on without it. The river always moves on. You are very comfortable now. The night is very deep. The world beyond this moment feels distant and unimportant, and the world of ancient Egypt feels closer than it has all evening, close enough to touch, close enough to smell the incense and the warm stone and the faint sweetness of the river reeds. We have been moving through this world for a long time together. Tonight, we're slowed down even further. We go somewhere quiet and enclosed, somewhere lit by oil lamps and smelling of paint and dust. Tonight, we go into the tombs. Fact 59. The decoration of an ancient Egyptian tomb was not simply a matter of beautification. It was a profound act of magical protection. The images and texts painted and carved onto tomb walls were believed to come alive in the afterlife, providing the deceased with everything they needed for eternity. A painted loaf of bread was a real loaf of bread in the world beyond. A painted servant was a real servant. A scene of musicians playing was real music, drifting through the chambers of the dead forever. The tomb was not a memorial. It was a fully provisioned home for the soul, stocked with everything a person could ever want, rendered permanent in paint and stone. You could eat a painting. You could listen to a carved song. Fact 60. The texts written on tomb walls and on papyrus scrolls buried with the dead are among the most fascinating documents to survive from the ancient world. The earliest of these, carved onto the walls of pyramid chambers during the Old Kingdom, are called the Pyramid Texts, and they are the oldest known religious texts in human history, dating to around 2400 BCE. They are spells and prayers and hymns designed to protect the dead king and guide him safely through the underworld, into the presence of the gods. Some of the images they conjure are extraordinarily vivid. The dead king rising like a bird of prey, climbing a ladder of light into the sky, taking his seat among the imperishable stars. Words written in stone 4,500 years ago, still legible, still resonant. Fact 61. Over time, these funerary texts evolved and became more widely available. What began as texts reserved for royalty gradually filtered down through the centuries to the nobility and eventually to anyone who could afford to have them written. By the time of the New Kingdom, around 1550 BCE, a new compilation had emerged, a collection of spells, hymns, and illustrated vignettes that Egyptologists have named the Book of the Dead, though the Egyptians themselves called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day. It was a guidebook for the afterlife, a map of the dangers and wonders awaiting the soul, and the words needed to navigate them safely. A handbook for the journey beyond, written with extraordinary care, illustrated with luminous detail, and placed in the hands of the dead. Our Fact 62. One of the most famous passages in the Book of the Dead describes the whole of two truths, the great chamber of judgment where the dead person's heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at. The deceased had to recite the negative confession, a list of 42 sins they declared they had not committed. I have not stolen. I have not told lies. I have not caused anyone to weep. I have not killed. I have not acted with insolence. The list is striking in its specificity, and in how familiar many of its concerns feel across the gulf of thousands of years. Honesty, kindness, fairness, restraint. The things that mattered then are the things that still matter now. Fact 63. If the weighing of the heart went well, if the heart balanced perfectly against the feather, the soul was declared justified and welcomed into the field of reeds. But if the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, it was thrown to a terrifying creature called a mit, a chimera with the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, who devoured it on the spot. This second death was the true death, the one the Egyptians feared above all else. Not the ending of the body, which was inevitable and manageable, but the ending of the soul, the annihilation of the self. A mit waited in the hall, patient and hungry, and the feather sat perfectly still on the scale. Our fact 64. The god who presided over all of this, who watched the weighing, who guided souls through the underworld, who embalmed and protected the dead, was Anubis, the jackal-headed god, one of the oldest and most beloved deities in the entire Egyptian pantheon. His color was black, not the black of darkness, but the black of fertile Nile silt, the black of regeneration and new growth. He was not a frightening figure. Exactly. He was a guardian. His long, elegant jackal face appears in tomb after tomb, painted with extraordinary care, turned towards the viewer with an expression that is watchful but not unkind. He is waiting for you, but not impatiently. Fact 65. The journey through the underworld, the duat, was described in vivid detail in various Egyptian funerary texts, and it was a genuinely dramatic landscape. There were 12 gates, one for each hour of the night, each guarded by a fearsome serpent deity whose name had to be spoken aloud to pass. There were lakes of fire. There were fields of reeds where the blessed dead walked and rested. There was the solar bark of Ra himself, moving through the underworld each night on his journey towards the dawn, carrying the souls of the righteous with him. The afterlife was not stillness. It was a voyage. It was active and vivid and full of wonder. Our fact 66. To help with this journey, wealthy Egyptians were buried with small figurines called shaptis, from an Egyptian word meaning roughly answerer. These small mummiform statuettes, made of faience or wood or stone, were enchanted to come alive in the afterlife and perform any labor demanded of the deceased by the gods. Richer burials might include hundreds of shaptis, one for each day of the year, plus overseers to manage them. If a god commanded the dead person to plow a field or carry a load, a shapti would step forward and say, "I will do it," answering on their behalf. Thousands of these little figures have been found. Thousands of tiny workers, still standing at attention, still ready to answer. The oil lamp in the tomb chamber burns very low now. Its light moves softly over the painted walls, over the boats and the birds, the offerings and the prayers, the careful blue hieroglyphs that spell out the names of gods. The painted servants carry their painted offerings forever. The painted musicians play their painted instruments in perpetual, silent concert. And somewhere in the warm, incense-dark air of this place, something feels not frightening at all. Something feels, in fact, quite peaceful. The Egyptians were not obsessed with death. They were obsessed with life, with the idea that life was so beautiful, so valuable, so worth having, that it should be preserved and continued and carried forward into eternity by any means possible. The tombs are not monuments to ending. They are monuments to the refusal to end. A people who loved being alive so much that they painted the walls of their graves with everything they wanted to keep. The lamp goes out. The darkness is warm and soft and absolute. And somewhere just beyond it, the field of reeds waits, green and golden, beside an eternal river, exactly like home. Rest now. You have been found worthy. The darkness of the tomb has given way to something softer. A gray pink light at the edge of the world, the first suggestion of dawn. The stars are fading one by one, quietly, without fuss, the way the best guests always leave, slipping away before the morning fully arrives, leaving the sky to its gradual brightening. The river catches the early light and holds it, trembling, on its surface. A new day in ancient Egypt. We have spent so long in the sacred and the ceremonial, in temples and tombs and the corridors of power. But this morning, in this gentle early light, we do something different. We walk through the streets. We visit the workshops and the markets and the schools. We listen to the city waking up. Tonight, this last stretch of night before sleep fully takes you, we celebrate the ordinary. Fact 67. The ancient Egyptians were great musicians, and music was woven into almost every aspect of daily life. It accompanied religious ceremonies and royal banquets, harvest festivals and funerals, the rowing of boats and the grinding of grain. Egyptian musicians played a wide variety of instruments, harps of extraordinary elegance, some standing taller than a person, their wooden frames carved and painted. Lutes and lyres, flutes made of bone or reed, clappers carved from ivory or wood, clicked rhythmically together in the hands. Drums of various sizes. Sistrums, a kind of ceremonial rattle sacred to the goddess Itha, shaken by priestesses in temple rituals, their soft metallic shimmer filling the incense-heavy air. Music for the gods. Music for the grain. Music for the dead. Music, simply, for the joy of it. Fact 68. The goddess Athena deserves a moment of her own. She was one of the most beloved and widely worshipped deities in the entire Egyptian pantheon, a goddess of love, beauty, music, dance, fertility, and joy. She was depicted as a woman with the ears of a cow, or sometimes as a cow herself, gentle and magnificent. Her temple at Dendera, built in the Ptolemaic period, survives in remarkable condition, and its ceiling is painted with one of the most celebrated astronomical charts from the ancient world, a circular map of the night sky known as the Dendera zodiac, showing constellations and planets in careful detail. A goddess of joy, with the stars painted on her ceiling. Fact 69. Dance was equally important in Egyptian life, and again it crossed every boundary of sacred and secular. Professional dancers performed at banquets and festivals. In temples, dancing was a form of worship, a way of delighting the gods and moving divine energy through the world. Images on tomb walls show dancers in mid-movement, their bodies bent into graceful arcs, their hair flying, their white linen robes swirling. Some dancers performed acrobatic backbends and handstands. Others moved in slow, processional lines. The body in motion, offered up to the divine, was considered genuinely beautiful and genuinely holy. To dance well was to pray well. Fact 70. The ancient Egyptians also loved games and sport. Wrestling was popular and depicted in great detail on the walls of tombs at Beni Hassan, showing sequences of moves in what reads almost like an illustrated manual. Swimming was widespread given the proximity of the river. Archery, rowing, and stick fighting were practiced. But perhaps the most charming evidence of Egyptian leisure is the board game Senet, one of the oldest board games in human history, played in Egypt for over 3,000 years. The board was a grid of 30 squares. The pieces moved according to the throw of casting sticks or knucklebones, and the game acquired deep religious significance over time, coming to represent the soul's journey through the underworld. You could play your way through the afterlife, roll the right number, and advance towards the light. Fact 71. Education in ancient Egypt was largely practical and apprenticeship-based for most children, who learned their parents' trade by working alongside them from a young age. The son of a carpenter became a carpenter. The daughter of a weaver learned to weave. But for those selected for scribal training, education was rigorous and demanding. Students copied out classic texts over and over, literary works, mathematical problems, medical texts, model letters, until the knowledge was deeply embedded. One famous text used as a scribal exercise essentially lists the many sufferings of a soldier's life in order to make students grateful for their comfortable scholarly existence. Ancient Egypt had motivational education. The strategy was guilt. It worked. Fact 72. Mathematics was central to Egyptian practical life, essential for calculating the area of fields after the Nile flood redistributed the silt and blurred the boundaries between plots, for measuring quantities of grain for tax purposes, for planning building projects, for calculating the proportions of bread and beer needed to feed a workforce. The ancient Egyptians used a base 10 number system and had symbols for 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, and 1 million. The symbol for 1 million was a figure of a man with his arms raised above his head in an expression of astonishment, as if even the Egyptians found the concept of a million slightly overwhelming. A number so large it required a picture of someone throwing their hands up in amazement. Fact 73. Egyptian architects and engineers used mathematical principles of remarkable sophistication. They understood and applied concepts related to what we would now call pi and the golden ratio in their constructions, whether intuitively arrived at through practice or consciously understood as mathematical principles is still debated. The Rhind mathematical papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE and now held in the British Museum, contains 84 mathematical problems complete with work solutions. Problems involving fractions, areas, volumes, and the calculation of the slope of a pyramid sides, expressed using a unit called the sect. A homework sheet from 3,500 years ago, still perfectly legible, still utterly logical. Fact 74. The ancient Egyptians also understood the basics of what we would now call chemistry, even if they had no such word for it. They produced faience, that luminous turquoise glaze we mentioned long ago in another part of our night, through a sophisticated process of heating quartz sand with minerals. They manufactured glass. They produced a range of pigments with chemical precision. The Egyptian blue was spoke of, as well as greens, reds, yellows, and blacks, each created from specific mineral compounds, each ground and mixed and applied with great care. The colors on tomb walls 4,000 years old are still vivid because the people who made them understood, practically and empirically, how to make things last. They were chemists who called themselves painters. The city is waking up now around you. Somewhere nearby, a baker has already been at work for hours. The bread needs time. It always needs time. And the smell drifts warm and yeasty through the cool morning air. A child is being called for breakfast. A dog stretches in a patch of early sunlight. A scribe settles cross-legged on a mat and uncaps his palette, the little cakes of black and red pigment waiting beside the clean papyrus. The river catches the pink of the dawn sky. A boat loaded with grain moves slowly downstream, its sails slack in the still morning air, its crew leaning on their oars with the unhurried ease of people who know the current will do most of the work. This is just a Tuesday in ancient Egypt. Just an ordinary morning, 4,000 years ago, in a civilization that had been running smoothly for so long that ordinary mornings was something it had perfected. Bread, music, mathematics, games by lamplight, a goddess with stars on her ceiling. The extraordinary ordinary, repeated daily, for 3,000 years. Let the bread smell carry you. Let the river light hold you. Let the scribe's brush move quietly in the background of your dreaming. Scratch, scratch, scratch against the papyrus. The words are being written down. You are being written down, safe and still and held in the oldest story ever told. The morning light is warm and golden now. It falls in long, slanted bars across the stone floor, across the papyrus, across the sleeping dog in the courtyard. The baker's bread is out of the oven and cooling on a flat stone. The scribe has paused his writing and is looking out across the rooftops towards the river, where the grain boat has long since rounded the bend and disappeared from sight. We are near the end of our journey tonight. We have walked the length and breadth of this ancient world together, from the flooding Nile to the painted tomb, from the court of the pharaoh to the scribal school, from the sacred scarab to the stars on Earth's ceiling. We have come a very long way, but there is a little further to go. A few last things to notice in the warm morning light, before we'll let it all dissolve into sleep. Tonight we end where all things end, and where all things begin again. We end with time itself. Fact 75. Ancient Egypt did not exist in isolation. It was part of a vast, interconnected ancient world, and its influence spread far beyond its own borders in ways we are still tracing today. Egyptian art, architecture, religion, and administrative systems influenced the ancient Nubians to the south, the Canaanites and Phoenicians to the northeast, the Greeks and Romans to the north. The very concept of the pharaoh as a divine king echoed through subsequent Mediterranean cultures. The obelisks that once stood at the entrances of Egyptian temples now stand in Rome, Paris, London, Istanbul, and New York, carried away by latest civilizations who understood, even if they could not fully articulate why, that these tapered towers of granite carried some fundamental authority. Egypt exported itself quietly into the bloodstream of the world. Fact 76. The obelisks themselves are extraordinary objects, carved from single pieces of granite, often from the quarries at Aswan, hundreds of kilometers from where they would eventually stand. They could weigh hundreds of tons. The logistics of quarrying, transporting, and erecting them was staggering even by modern standards. One famous unfinished obelisk still lies in the quarry at Aswan, partially cut from the bedrock, abandoned when a crack appeared in the stone. It is the largest known ancient obelisk, measuring nearly 42 meters long. It simply lies there in the rock, one side still attached to the earth, a monument to ambition and the unexpected resistance of stone. Even Egypt, occasionally, was defeated by geology. Fact 77. The ancient Egyptians had a concept of time that was fundamentally different from our own linear understanding of past, present, and future. They distinguished between two kinds of time: Nihe, cyclical time, the endlessly repeating cycles of the sun and the Nile and the seasons, and yet, eternal and unchanging time, the permanent and perfect state that the gods inhabited and that the dead aspired to enter. Life was lived in Nihe, the turning wheel. The afterlife existed in Dyet, the still point at the center of the wheel. To die well was to step out of the cycle and into the eternal. Not an ending, a stillness, a deepening. Fact 78. This circular understanding of time meant that the Egyptians were deeply comfortable with repetition. Indeed, they found great power and safety in it. Rituals performed the same way, in the same order, using the same words, at the same time each year, were not monotonous. They were load-bearing. They held the universe in its proper shape. The daily ritual of tending the god's statue in the temple was not rote obligation. It was the act that kept the sun rising. Every morning the priests washed and dressed the statue, and every morning the sun rose, and the connection between those two things was felt to be real and structural. We do this, and the world continues. We stop, and who knows? Fact 79. One of the most enduring and recognizable symbols to emerge from ancient Egypt is the ankh, a cross with a loop at the top, found absolutely everywhere in Egyptian art and hieroglyphics. It meant life. Simply and completely, life. Gods are depicted holding it to the noses of the dead, breathing life back into them. Pharaohs carried it as a symbol of their divine vitality. It appeared on temple walls, on amulets, on jewelry, on the handles of mirrors. It was the most fundamental thing the Egyptians could think of to represent, the fact of being alive, rendered in a single elegant shape that has survived for 1,000 years and is still immediately recognized and worn and drawn today. A symbol of life, still living. Fact 80. The ancient Egyptian language itself survived in a transformed form far longer than the civilization that created it. After the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE, the old language gradually gave way to Arabic in daily life. But in the liturgy of the Coptic Christian Church, the ancient Christian community of Egypt, one of the oldest Christian traditions in the world, a late form of the ancient Egyptian language continued to be used in religious services. It is still used today, in Coptic churches in Egypt and around the world. Somewhere right now, in a church in Cairo or Alexandria or London or Sydney, ancient Egyptian syllables are being spoken aloud in prayer. The oldest language still in living use, wrapped in incense, rising towards a painted ceiling. Fact 81. The city of Alexandria, which we visited briefly in an earlier part of our night, remained one of the great intellectual centers of the world for centuries after the fall of the pharaohs. It was in Alexandria that the mathematician Euclid wrote his foundational work on geometry. It was in Alexandria that the astronomer Ptolemy developed his model of the solar system. It was in Alexandria that the philosopher Hypatia, one of the first notable women mathematicians and astronomers in recorded history, taught and wrote in the 4th and 5th century CE, her lectures drawing students from across the Mediterranean. A city built by a Macedonian conqueror on Egyptian soil became the mind of the ancient world. Fact 82. And yet, for all its influence, ancient Egypt remained in many ways deeply rooted in its own particular landscape. The black soil and the red desert, Kemet and Deshret, the black land and the red land, defined the Egyptian worldview in the most fundamental way. The black land was life, safety, home, the known world. The red land was danger, foreignness, chaos, the unknown. To go into the desert was to leave the ordered world behind. Every day, the boundary between them was clear and sharp and meaningful. You could stand with one foot in the black soil and one in the red sand and feel, physically, the boundary between the world and whatever lay beyond it. Order and chaos, separated by a line you could step across. Fact 83. In the end, what is perhaps most remarkable about ancient Egypt is not its pyramids or its gods or its golden death mosques, extraordinary as all of those are. It is its stubborn continuity. 3,000 years is a span of time so large it defeats easy imagination. The time between the building of the Great Pyramid and the death of Cleopatra is greater than the time between the death of Cleopatra and today. When Cleopatra visited the pyramids at Giza, they were already older to her than she is to us. Ancient Egypt was ancient, even to the ancient Egyptians. And still it held. Still it continued. Still the river flooded and receded. The crops grew and were harvested. The sun rose and was thanked. The dead were wrapped in linen and sent on their way with everything they might need. 3,000 years of continuity, of Ma'at maintained, of the feather held steady on the scale. The morning is fully here now. The golden light has reached every corner of the courtyard. The dog has rolled over in the sunlight and gone back to sleep. The baker is eating his own bread, tearing pieces off a warm flat loaf and chewing slowly, looking at nothing in particular, perfectly content. The scribe has put down his brush. The papyrus is rolled and tied. The words are safe. Somewhere to the west, in the Valley of the Kings, the pharaohs sleep in their carved chambers, surrounded by everything they loved, waiting in the eternal stillness of Diet, the unchanging time, while the world turns and turns and turns around them in its great cycles of Nihe. And the Nile moves on, as it always has, as it always will, dark and slow and generous, carrying everything, the silt, the light, the grain boats, the funeral barges, the reflections of stars that have been watching this river for longer than any human mind can comfortably hold. You have traveled a long way tonight. You have walked through one of the longest and most extraordinary stories ever lived. You have stewed in the temples and the markets and the tombs. You have heard the music and smelled the bread and watched the stars rise over the desert. And now, like the pharaohs in their valley, like the cat curled on the warm stone, like the baker with his closed eyes and his full stomach and his quiet morning, sleep well.